And now to unpack this a little bit further, we do have a political analyst in studio. Mr. Kgadima, thank you so much for joining us here on Morning Prime.
Thank you.
Firstly, let's talk about the clear factionalism and infighting within the ANC. Do you believe this is what cost the party its loss in support?
Well, Lauren, maybe before I get there, let's give a worthy congratulations to Wade van Niekerk, who not only won the first gold in the Olympics, but also smashed a 17-year record. So that's really worthy of a celebration.
Definitely.
Yeah. And even on the more also serious business,
political side
of the year is really, the state of the ANC where it is now. I think the ANC finds itself in a very difficult position. A difficult position whereby it has not really been able to address the perception which has been formulated largely in the mainstream media. But when you really analyze that perception, you find that the problem isn't as big as it has been made out to be. But like all things, it has been inflated to be in such a manner that you'll say, well, this party is actually dysfunctional. But indeed, I think there are a number of things. We've seen in some of the provinces, in some of the regions of the African National Congress, we've seen that indeed there's been a lot of infighting, there's been a lot of dysfunctionality. And all of that, I reduce it to one thing only. My view is that the African National Congress today finds itself not being able to pay off the debt it took 20 years ago. And what is that debt? The debt it took 20 years ago was expanding membership, mobilizing rapidly, whereby in the 2012 Mangaung Conference, ANC had well over 1.4 million paid-up members. But in that process, what it didn't do, and it cannot microwave now, was that issue of political education, educating those members, those card-carrying members with the ethos, the values of the African National Congress, and in two areas, both as a liberation party and the role that it had played in the history of ensuring the end of apartheid, but also now as a political party that is actually in government. For example, I noticed from the press statement that was issued after the NEC, the 4-day NEC Lekgotla, that only now the councillors are going to be trained. And I think that's one of the things that for me worries me, that in fact the eligibility for even to be a candidate is something that I think the ANC needs to handle differently. Not just the ANC, by the way, all political parties, to say what actually makes you eligible. There has to be a clear educational system and a syllabus that says for one to be eligible either as a councillor candidate or even at the provincial as well as the national legislatures, there has to be that training process. For example, for one to be a doctor, there are certain qualifications you expect. But when it comes to politics, a very important role in the functionality of a country and the state, we haven't really put in place those. So it worries me that training is only going to happen now, but like all things, it's not just the ANC that is embarking on that. Yes, we congratulate them, but all other political parties as well, I think they're going to be trying to do the same thing, say, how do we now train these councillors that have been elected into actually understanding their role and function? But yes, the ANC, it cannot microwave the problems that I think started 20 years ago. There's going to be a slow process. So things have gotten low, yes, and most people within the ANC are feeling really morose and disappointed by what has happened. But like all things in life, I think the ANC has got a very good chance of regeneration. And it's through that regeneration that the country actually needs to be supportive of, because we need a political party that is functional. If you look now, the results of this local government election, very worrying, particularly in the metros whereby there has been no clear winner. I know that ANC has lost their leadership or to be the governing party, but we end up with a situation whereby there's been no clear winner. For me, it tells a much more larger story, that perhaps the manner in which we've been doing politics, it left us in such a state where now we actually have to be worried about the provisions of services and investment and job opportunities that everybody agrees we need to do.
Now, speaking of this training of the councillors, why has it taken so long to address this matter? Did they have to wait for a poor result in the elections in order to actually do something about it?
I think this result was actually a very important knock on the head to say, wake up, understand that this is actually serious. Because up till that time, I think you find that the electorate, by and large, even people who would ordinarily have supported the ANC by voting for it, were now having to rely on the mainstream media to say, but what does this party stand for? And of course, the negative narrative that we have seen, that everybody has been reporting on, that certainly hasn't helped, because they didn't have people who could read from the one book, same chapter, same paragraph, in terms of what is the ANC doing. And of course, there are other things that I think are a little bit more arbitrary. People speak, or a little bit more abstract rather, that you say, well, we have to tackle corruption. But there isn't a clear mechanism as to, well, how are we going to tackle corruption? We live in a country with the rule of law. There are law enforcement agencies. And for me, the more we talk about that corruption is a problem and all parties seem to be helpless in actually tackling it, for me, it paints a picture of perhaps we have not paid particular attention to the law enforcement agencies and the regulatory framework within which they function, the efficacy of those law enforcement agencies. For me, it is worrying that everybody knows or talks that they have knowledge of corruption, but there isn't many people who are approaching the law enforcement agencies with credible evidence. And even for them to release a statement to say we are going to deal with it, the question is the mechanics. How? How are you going to tackle it? That I found also to be worrying, that we're still talking about the problem in terms of, instead of talking about how we're going to, and what are the platforms, what are the avenues that ordinary citizens who we all agree say corruption is a problem. How can they go about? What role can they play? We need an engaged citizenry. And that, unfortunately, platform is still very much vague as to how it will be executed.
Mr. Kgadima, I'm just going to have to pause it for now as we just take us through some bites from the NEC. Meanwhile, the ANC is still trying very hard to garner majority in Hung municipality. But what is not clearly negotiable is President Zuma's removal. ANC Secretary General Gwede Mantashe confirmed that the party had approached the EFF in forging an alliance. Mantashe said a 5-member delegation from the ANC was engaging with Malema's party. Conceding that the negotiations are tough, ANC senior leaders said everyone wants their pound of flesh and it's for the party to decide where to compromise.
When the EFF meets us, it demands the president to step down and therefore, while in the shadow of the president. You know, when you negotiate with people, I was talking to the NEC this afternoon, I said to them, when you negotiate coalitions, it's almost an impossible task. I'm part of that team. Because everybody you talk to want a pound of flesh. On councils, we're talking to as many parties on working with us. But we've met EFF as a delegation of the ANC of 5 members of the NEC who are dealing with this matter. We've met EFF, we've met a number of parties. We continue meeting these parties to talk about working together in municipalities where there's no outright winner. We met AIC today. Very early in the morning they came and we met them, we discussed with them. We're talking to as many parties as we can.
Let's now return to our in-studio chat to further unpack this with political analyst Tshepo Kgadima. Let's talk now about these hung municipalities and possible coalitions. Do you foresee the ANC and EFF, joining forces or joining hands here?
My view is that we'll probably end up with a coalition council or municipalities of some form or another. However, I've got a great doubt as to whether they will be able to hold within the 5 years. I foresee a situation whereby there's going to be endless conflicts, and in the end, I think in a democracy such as ours, a clear winner is what is preferable. When you have a coalition, there's going to be one or two things to happen. Either that the parties are going to be competing with each other, preparing for the next election, in this case the general election in 2019, and therefore the councils will become, or municipalities will be dysfunctional, the decision making will be much more slower, but the residents are going to be the ones that are suffering. The other scenario is a situation whereby some of the parties that go into this coalition most certainly will be then have to merge and dissolve by themselves their own identity and merge with the more powerful, the more stronger coalition partner. So those are the two things that I'm seeing. So either way, if we see a situation of dysfunctionality, it means we are going to be in having by-elections pretty soon. And can a coalition deal be threshed out this week, for example? One has to wait and see what the economic freedom fighters say tomorrow during their press briefing following the negotiations. Because if you look at the metros, Johannesburg, Tshwane, even Nelson Mandela Bay, EFF are actually the ones that hold the cards on whether or not there will be a coalition government or there's going to be a rerun of the elections. And as it's been said, most certainly, I think that they're going to demand a pound of flesh. Will that be able to carry through? Yeah, I personally am very worried about a coalition government in terms of the citizenry. By the time they find each other, by the time they decide really that, look, we must work together in the best interest of the residents, I think a lot of time will be lost in a time where we can't afford that.
So are you saying a by-election would be the best option?
I believe that you need a clear winner. There has to be that 50+1. Unless, as time goes on, we have a constitutional reform or amendment to say, look, a clear majority will be the one that carries the day. But certainly you need to have one party that would have been voted by a majority. And in this case, the majority is 50+1. That for me is the most desirable and the most workable political solution.
And now if no coalitions are formed and we do turn to by-elections, talk us through that process and how it works from there.
Well, if there's no coalition, there's certainly, I think, be a 90-day period whereby then the administrator will be appointed by the Ministry of Cooperative Governance. And then in that after that 90-day period, there will be an election. And should there be a rerun, I clearly believe that there will be a winner who will have the 50+1 required majority to be able to form a council. Because when you look at it, I find that also there's a lot of voters' remorse out there. There are a lot of people who didn't participate in voting, and now when they're starting to really analyze and think through the consequences of their not voting, which has brought us this, they are regretting. I think that the voter turnout will most certainly be a lot higher, even in those areas. We have to remember that I think Gauteng came to about 42% voter turnout in this election. Certainly, Gauteng dragged everybody down, even bringing our national average to 58%. So, very worrying. Should there be a rerun, there will be a much higher voter turnout.
And do you foresee this in 2019 general elections, this poor voter turnout, especially in Gauteng, unless the ANC don't do something about it?
Look, very difficult to say. I mean, if I look at it, I think all the political parties, by and large, they rely on what I normally refer to as the high tech. For example, the ANC in this case, as well as the Democratic Alliance, they spend oodles and oodles of cash in what? Doing advertising, running a campaign. But those that are in corporate will tell you, advertising is like the defense budget of a country. It's not the one that you go and win a war with. What you win a war with will be doing public relations. But public relations in the form of political parties' life is that of ensuring that you are there throughout in between elections. You don't only make voter contact through at the time of elections, but throughout you keep the citizenry engaged. Even those that are not members of your party, you have to find a platform by which you can engage them, get to know what is happening, and also be able to encourage them and educate on the importance of voting. clear to us now that the importance of voting in this local government election was not really highlighted, hence the voter turnout was low. And I mean, lastly, the other thing I just want to touch on is that there seems to be this narrative which is more symptomatic of the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. Because they're saying that President Jacob Zuma is the personification of all our woes. But when you ask, he says, well, is that actually the correct way to go? My view is that it is really motivated by more of a sinister, evil motive of make the ANC dysfunctional, let it break apart, so that then another force will take over. And from all the information I have looked at and assessed is that such a sinister force is not even from within the borders of this republic. It's an outside force that seeks to see that, like, you got to make the country dysfunctional, because if the ANC it is dysfunctional and it breaks apart, most certainly we will not be, we will lose our sovereignty. I think what the ANC could do well is to really communicate once again in terms of its processes. The National Executive Committee is there now, the 86 people that are there, they came into those positions as a direct result of a democratic process where there was clear nominations and elections, and the period or the tenure of that National Executive Committee plus the officials is 5 years. That 5 years ends in 2017 December. So the ANC has not been able to communicate that clearly. Hence, even the people that have been calling for a recall have completely, they are calling for something that is even unconstitutional in terms of the ANC constitution as to how that National Executive Committee came about. However, the risk that the ANC faces now, and one can only observe as to how they manage it, is how do they then manage the succession come 2017? Because as we have seen historically, is that there's a great deal of time spent talking about one position, and that of president. But there's never a question that or interrogation as to tell us about the 85 other people who are going to be in the National Executive as well as the NEC. What qualification criteria, what eligibility criteria is put in place? And in not being able to communicate that and not being able to manage that process, I think is what adds to the challenges that the ANC finds itself in today.
Definitely the lack of transparency there. Mr. Kgadima, thank you so much for joining us here on Morning Prime. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for, but thank you so much. That is Tshepo Kgadima, who is a political analyst, talking about the ANC's road ahead after their NEC. Help is at hand.